time is something that it's almost hip not to believe in anymore. I feel there's so much going on out there about how arbitrary and restrictive and limiting the very complicated popular conception of time is. And people are so willing to say, oh, it's made up. Oh, it's just a construct. But we still have to live in it. And oh, isn't that so oppressive? And like, let's cancel daylight saving time and like let's change the calendar to, you know, like people are experimenting with time. 4-day work week. You know, there's so many radical beliefs about time right now. And something I love to talk about with you is just sort of the people, the moon, the popular experience of reality and what that shows us about where we are. And I wonder what is coming up for you in all this turbulence that we see all around us and in so many conversations with so many people having to do with time.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you kind of managed to strike upon the one facet of what time could be that didn't come up as I was sort of, you know, preparing my body to talk about it. And, you know, you have a sense of like how I work through these things by this point. I feel like, you know, I'm very much like trying to empty myself of anything which comes up. So, you know, a lot of stuff was coming up around like the metaphysics of it, around the embodiment of it, like, you know, what do we know about the mechanics of it and what does that not explain? But somehow you managed to find something related to, I'll call it like the political reception of time, perhaps.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it works like
that is what I was asking about for sure.
Yeah. And that's like, it's so far away from like, you know, all the things I previously mentioned.
We'll get there, don't worry.
I mean, I think, you know, this is like probably like a really good opportunity for me to go on for too long about like my overall view of like, you know, energy and thought forms and stuff. But without doing that, I guess I could say that like what you're touching upon is like very much in the realm of like what I would call thought forms. And maybe like somewhat connected to like mechanical embodied like views of time, like when you mentioned like shortening the amount of time in the work week, you know, that's probably you know, in some ways connected to how people are feeling about the cycles in their body, right? I think like if we kind of like peer into like the realm of where those kinds of ideas come from, there's a whole lot of like thought form there. There's a whole lot of like economic thought form, a whole lot of like you know, like I guess like social temperature kind of thought form. But I do like that theoretically it's addressing something which I feel like is directionally accordant with the way I think about, you know, how we think about time now and maybe like how we're starting to think about time, which is to respect it as being like something which arises from the confluence of many, many, many cycles, right? And some of those are like, yeah, like the circadian rhythms of the body. How much can we actually, yeah, like load our bodies before we have to unload? You know, does unloading correspond to like recuperation, or is there some kind of like fudge factor between recuperation and unloading? And, you know, how does that affect our ability to like load ourselves again? Which I think gets kind of closer to like metaphysics that like I tend to like paddle in a lot of the time. But yeah, some of the other things you mentioned, like daylight savings time, I mean, to me that's like a very like you know, it's a somewhat clear example of how thinking of time as an abstract concept is very like you know, viscerally divorced from what's happening in the sky, what's happening on Earth, and then, you know, also like it accounts for what's happening within our bodies and between our bodies, right? Because there's this sense that, like, based on what's happening on Earth, what's happening in houses, like, we're going to use electricity a certain way. We're going to enjoy more sunlight, etc. So I feel like, as you can already see, like, hopefully I'm answering your question, but
You are.
I'm kind of like already sort of bridging it to like the things that I care about when it comes to time. And I'm picking out like the positives about how people are thinking about it. And surprisingly not giving any of my awareness to some of the things which feel sort of archonic or thought form related to me.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to start there was because I think that it's one of the few places, even in the popular, or maybe to use your word, political consciousness, where the metaphysical reality underlying the thought form is bursting through. It's one of the levers that people are reaching for to try to pull to stop this machinery of nonsense. And you pointed to so many, let's call them like more real reference of time than clocks and calendars, etc. Like the body, like the seasons, like the sky, and and the way you put it when you were talking about the body, I thought was really beautiful, because it was about capacity. It was about just how much like the ultimate measure of time, almost, for the human, or for the body, for the living body of any kind, is like how much action can you take before rest becomes necessary. And rest is just becoming necessary on such a massive scale that I feel like the very nature of whatever time is bursting through the walls of illusion. And Saturn is saying what's up to everyone. So now I do want you to tell me something about what's on the other side of that matrix or barrier that's being burst through here. Like it's such a defining construct of our shared experience. Time, whatever time really is so defining. What is it like for you when you let go of thought forms and feel into what's there?
Thank you for the question, and also for reflecting and making legible what I said to you previously. No, you do a great job. Yeah, I mean, I've been saying to people recently how like my guidance has me navigating by time versus space. Like, what does that mean? I feel like hopefully this frames things a little bit, but I have like a pretty extreme approach to like, thought forms in general. I'd say like every time a thought comes up, I try to see if it can be released, and most of the time it can. And most of the time at this point, like I don't get repeats of the same kinds of thoughts which are attached to the same blockages in my body. But which is to say that like I think the way that probably most people like think about, I would say, like turning possibility into time is like literally to think about it, right? So in so many lineages, they talk about the upper chakras, the throat, and the third eye as being like, part of the causal layer of the energy body. And for me, like what that means is basically that like what comes out of like the many possibilities which flow through Earth on, what you could say are like many, many different timelines, ends up being kind of like imprinted as time by what we see, like how we conceptualize what we see, how we turn that into symbols, how we operate on those symbols, how that surfaces opportunity, and then how we choose and how we execute an opportunity, right? Like at like a very like non-granular level, you could say. Um, so when I say that, like, I navigate reality by layers of time, and not by, like, say, space or by thought forms, I would say that, like, my way of being, and this is very ennudening for me, you can say, is to, like, literally, like, what it feels like is I'm trying to navigate the layers of a body, and those layers reflect different scopes of time. And then based on, like, how those layers feel and, like, how many, different ways I could navigate those layers. And I'm thinking very much of, like, fascia and, like, sheets and layers of collagen is, it's very somatic. Like, I know what it feels like for my body to touch chaos, and I know what it feels like for my body to touch order. And then I end up on a timeline observing myself doing the things that got me onto that timeline. So, yeah, like, I think obviously, like, I'm invoking a lot of thought forms with the words I'm saying, but hopefully in a way, I've answered your question. Like, this is kind of the way time feels to me, as stripped away from thought forms as possible while still having to articulate them in thought form. Yeah, does that help?
Yes. The thing I picked up right from the very beginning of it is that you made it seem particular to experience this as time as opposed to space, which are things that we understand from physics to be perspectives on the same medium or something. And I didn't hear you say that time is like the more real or more correct orientation to relationship to it than space is, or something. So I want to know what what your, like, relationship to that relativity is. Like, what is space consciousness as opposed to time consciousness, given that it's just a point of view?
Yeah, it's such a beautiful question. I mean, so I guess to talk about this, I have to sort of lay out things which are very difficult to justify, I would say, empirically, for sure. But I think I'll say, like, for me, like, a very I'll like put out some definitions of time, which I feel like help to orient this, right? And one of my favorites is, like, how in the Bulgarian language, the word for time, which is vreme, is also the name or the word for weather.
Ooh,
And
that's a good one.
and then when you say vremeto, it's like to make, like, the definite article of the weather is like a season, right? Which takes it right back towards, like, more like something that we tend to think of as time, or something which can be, like, accumulated or measured, chopped up via thought form, right? So yeah, I guess, like, for me, like, you know how much I dislike hierarchies of information, I feel. But for me, like, time is primordial to space. I would say that, like, my understanding for most humans, from given my definition of time, is that, like, even when you're not looking at a clock, we sense that time passes on a somatic level, right? And you could say that, like, our heart's beating, our lungs are expanding and deflating instead of collapsing. There's so many cycles that are going on in our body, which take place in a time, and they give us a feeling of time, like a weather of time. And I'd say before we had, eyes, before we were vertebrates, I would say that, like, our ancestors, as far as, like, species go, did not really have the apparatus to perceive space in the ways that we tend to perceive space. So in that sense, I would say that time feels primary to space for me, and then also say for my ancestors. And
Uh-huh.
I'm leaving space there for people whose ancestors have like a different kind of development through time.
Yeah.
But yeah, does that answer your
Yeah.
question?
Well, I think my main reflection is that my lineage is also experienced time as primordial. So I'm becoming conscious of no one in this conversation being of a primordially spatial orientation.
Mm,
So I want to leave space for the possibility of that perspective.
hmm
Although I did hear something in what you just said that makes me interested in the word experience, which
hmm
is also which is how you described, first of all, the sort of, you know, uh, archaic life forms that couldn't experience, that didn't have a perceptual concept of space.
hmm
The implication being they experience time. But I think maybe what you were actually saying is more like time is just is a description of experience, and
hmm
something about whatever time is fundamentally
hmm
is a an ordering of experience, or experience takes place in a sequential manner. So
hmm
maybe it's almost that space, and this is again, like, perhaps there are other lineages that experience this a different way, but from what it feels like to me to consider spatial experience, it feels like everything everywhere all at once, right? To use a
hmm
very popular meme from a very beautiful film,
hmm
which is not an experience to me. Or maybe, to put it another way, I've had a few experiences like that I wouldn't call temporal or temporally located experiences. And that for the most part, what we call experience is things happening one at a time, or a few at a time. But really, and you said something about stepping outside of time, or seeing the I can't remember exactly how you said it, but you sort of said, you said something about being on a timeline and seeing how the timeline that you're on got that way or something. And that's a sequence. That's a sequence of experiences, and maybe we just call that time.
hmm No, yeah, I think you know, I really appreciate how you're articulating between two uses of time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, time is something that can be experienced, and also time is maybe like some kind of fundamental composition of like whatever we want to call the base material. I think you call it the medium, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of reality. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting discrepancy, I guess you could say, to like tumble around in my body mind. I'm trying to figure out if I was just using like is one just colloquial, right?
Uh-huh.
And does it make sense for us to actually like at least in this conversation name them as different things, which is like yeah, a somatic experience of time versus time as some kind of geometry or like the medium itself,
Uh-huh.
right? Yeah. Um, and yet there's something in my body mind which is telling me that there is a way to relate them versus just like hold them apart, which is difficult because it doesn't necessarily feel clarified in my field right now. Um, I mean, I think it's fair to say that like the somatic experience of time is like a very dense formation of karma, right? And which is to say that it's like we're we're pretty much like locked into some very small subset of ways of experiencing, the fundamental time, just by virtue of the way our bodies work. And, as much as you meditate, as many thought forms as you clear, like, I don't think you're going to get to a fundamentally different, like, sustainable experience of time without, like, your body perhaps doing something very unpleasant for you or for anybody unfortunate enough to be looking at it. But yeah, I think like maybe it's okay to leave it there for me at least is like um And I was kind of wondering if like this conversation would kind of go towards these places, but I think it's like very humanizing to say that, like, for instance, in your case, you said that experience, for something to be experienced, it has to be temporal, right? And I think um, I'll maybe qualify that as I tend to do and say that for some, it's worth us speaking about sustainable experiences of temporality as something distinct from the fundamental essence of whatever that is, right?
Mhm. We've reached the point in this time that you and I are sharing with each other where people outside of this time who are hearing the time that we spent talking about time together are going to become amused that the container that I have promised for these conversations in terms of time is going to be exceeded in the conversation about time, which is exactly how I should have known and hoped that this would go. But I want to be really respectful of that constraint because it's like one of the defining reasons that this show exists is to be generous toward the embodied lived experience of the time of the people listening so that it isn't completely filled with the thought forms of other people and that they get the the relational juice of these kinds of exchanges in as time respectful a way as possible. What do you think of that, given your sort of inclination to deconstruct things?
um, with respect to both, yeah, the fundamental essence of time and the somatic experience of time for anybody who's listening to this, as well as our own somatic experiences of time, and also with respect to fun. I guess I'll just like say that, like, for me, a deity named Kali is now like the cultivator of the third eye of the somatic, the body mind of our galaxy. And in, Malayalam and Sanskrit, like Kali literally means time. And it feels very appropriate that you could say perhaps that we're moving from like a Chronos archetype, which has a very rigid definition of time, to being like cultivated by a goddess like Kali, which in some ways you could say means like the multiple times to me. And being a little chaotic with people's time may lead to some stabilization of their time going forward or backward.